In November 2021, a man was found alive inside a tower believed to be abandoned since 1983. The rescue team heard his voice before they saw him, broadcasting on a frequency no longer in use. He hadn't expected the road to vanish. According to the outdated forestry map, there should have been a narrow maintenance trail leading straight to Tower 9. Instead, he'd been walking for nearly an hour through deep pine and packed snow, tracing what looked more like a forgotten animal path than any human-made track. His breath rose in clouds. The cold bit at the edges of his jacket. Every few minutes, he paused to check the compass and squint at the terrain, hoping for some kind of man-made line, wiring, fencing, even rusted signage. There was nothing. No birds, no distant hum of wind turbines, just the whisper of trees leaning gently against one another in the breeze. Eventually, through the thinning trees, a shape began to form, the outline of a narrow tower, barely visible above the canopy. Steel ribs, timber platform, a faded ladder zigzagging up its side. Tower 9. It looked exactly like the archived photo, tall, skeletal, and long since forgotten. The last official use of the lookout had been logged nearly 40 years ago, before satellite coverage had made such stations obsolete. But someone higher up in the Environmental Research Division had flagged it as technologically significant, claiming the analog radio equipment still inside might hold historical value. That's why he'd been sent out. Just 2 days, a checklist, a system sweep, and then back. It sounded simple enough. The climb up the metal ladder was harder than it looked. The rungs were stiff from frost, and his gear bag kept shifting on his back. At the top, he found a padlocked hatch just as expected. He entered the override code he'd been given, and the lock clicked open without issue. The interior smelled like dust and old batteries. Inside the cabin, the layout was surprisingly intact. A metal desk bolted to the floor, a fold-out cot against the rear wall, a cracked window facing north, and in the center, surrounded by notes and hand-drawn schematics, sat the old radio console. Boxy, heavy, cold to the touch. He powered it up out of habit, not expecting much. The battery was long dead, but when he connected the portable solar unit he'd brought, the radio panel lit up. Dial shifted. A single red light flickered once, then held. He adjusted the frequency dial. At first, there was nothing but static. Then, just briefly, he caught something. A voice. Faint, broken, male. "Copy. Still here." He leaned in, adjusting the antenna, but the signal faded as quickly as it came. He assumed it was bleed over from a nearby station, maybe even military chatter bouncing off the hills. Still, the tone of the voice unsettled him. It hadn't sounded recent. It had sounded old. He logged the signal's timestamp, jotted a few notes, and told himself he'd check again in the morning. That night, the temperature dropped well below freezing. He boiled snow for water, ate half a protein bar, and settled onto the cot fully dressed. The wind outside pushed against the tower, making the walls creak in long, steady intervals. He woke just after 3 a.m. The radio was on again. He hadn't touched it. And from the speaker, the same voice repeated the same words, just slightly louder this time. "Copy. Still here." But now there was something new in the background, breathing, and it wasn't his. He stared at the radio for nearly a full minute before moving. The voice coming through wasn't random static. It wasn't foreign interference. It had rhythm, cadence, just enough human warmth to make it unmistakably real. But what made it worse was that it sounded familiar. Not in the way a distant memory echoes, but more like hearing your own voicemail from years ago. Off, distorted, but undeniably you. He leaned closer, carefully adjusting the gain. The signal strengthened just long enough for the voice to finish its phrase. Copy. Still here. Then it looped again. Same words, same timing, same rasp at the end of the sentence. It wasn't a live transmission. It was a recording, a repeating message on an old frequency that hadn't been used in decades. And someone, or something, was still broadcasting it. He checked the frequency readout, 2217 kH. That shouldn't have been active. He pulled out the outdated regional band chart that had been stapled to the tower wall. 2217 was marked clearly in red ink, with one word printed next to it, dead. He turned off the radio just to see if the signal would stop. The voice cut out immediately. Silence returned. He waited a few seconds, hoping maybe he'd been half asleep. Maybe it had been some dream leaking into wakefulness. But when he powered it back on, the voice returned at the exact same point in the loop. Same pause, same inflection, same breath at the end. He backed away slowly, trying to piece together a rational explanation. Maybe the equipment was preloaded with an old emergency loop. Maybe someone had used the tower more recently than the record showed. Or maybe, just maybe, the voice wasn't his. He replayed it in his head again. The subtle drop in pitch, the way the word still held a little too long. He had never said those words aloud before, but somehow they felt like his. He didn't sleep the rest of the night. He sat in the chair, wrapped in a thermal blanket, watching the console blink its slow red pulse. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls, and every few hours the trees let out long, groaning creaks, like something massive moving beneath the surface. At dawn, he stepped outside to clear his head. The woods around the tower were quiet. Still no birds, no footprints, no motion in the tree line. Just frost-covered branches and a forest that didn't seem to breathe. He walked 20 meters out, just enough to see the tower from a distance. It looked even older in daylight. The steel bones were rusted orange at the edges, the cabin windows almost black with grime. And yet the antenna above it was straight, clean, no corrosion. He returned to the cabin, more curious now than afraid. If this was a loop, it had to have a source. He opened the access panel behind the desk and traced the cables down into the floor. They disappeared beneath the decking, older wiring, cloth insulated, not standard anymore. He followed them to a locked panel marked Relay. The key was taped to the underside of the table. When he opened it, he found an old magnetic recorder, a tape loop, still spinning. The reel looked ancient, cracked at the edges, coated in dust, but it was moving, that same line playing over and over. Copy. Still here. He removed the tape and examined the label. No name, no date, but something was written on the inner ring of the reel in pencil, barely visible. He heard it too. He didn't know who he was, but the implication was clear. Someone had been here before him. Someone had recorded that loop. And someone, maybe the same person, had heard their own voice coming from the speaker. He set the tape down and looked out the window again. The forest hadn't changed, but now the silence no longer felt empty. It felt expectant, as if the trees themselves were listening. The signal was gone by morning. When he turned on the radio again, all he heard was dead air. No voice, no static, no tape loop, just a quiet, low hum from the system, like a breath being held. He tried rewinding the reel he'd found, but the tape refused to play again.
The wheels spun, but no sound emerged. It was as if the message had already served its purpose and wouldn't repeat for anyone not meant to hear it again. Outside, the weather had changed. The air was heavier. The sun, which had filtered through the trees in streaks the day before, was hidden now behind a dull sky, and the wind had picked up, not enough to be dangerous, but enough to make the forest feel unrestless. He took out his satellite phone to check in with base camp. No signal. That didn't surprise him. The ridge wasn't known for great coverage. He moved to the tower's outer platform, climbed the short ladder to the upper antenna post, and held the phone high. Still, nothing. No bars, no error message, just a blank screen, waiting. He waited too. An hour passed, then two. No signal ever came. By the third hour, he had started checking his emergency transmitter, fully charged, correctly configured, and absolutely silent. He was alone. He told himself it was a temporary issue, weather-related, maybe a solar flare, maybe a broken satellite. But deep down, he could feel the shift. The tower wasn't just far from civilization, it was now outside of it. The radio equipment remained strangely active. It would hum or click softly even when powered down. Once, while inspecting the wiring under the floor, he heard a short burst of Morse code, too quick to catch but unmistakable. When he tried to trace the source, it stopped the second he moved. By nightfall, visibility had dropped.
A thick fog had rolled in, crawling through the pines and gathering around the base of the tower like rising water. He turned on the external spotlight, but it barely pushed more than a few meters into the mist. The world beyond the glass had become a blank wall of white and shadow. He decided to make a new log entry, something to mark the day and record the anomalies. When he opened the notebook he'd brought, he saw something written that hadn't been there before. It was his handwriting. Same tilt, same line weight, same peculiar way he always crossed the letter T slightly too high. But the entry wasn't one he'd made. Don't forget where the door is. He stared at the words for a long time, not because of their meaning, but because of the date written above them. 3 days ahead. He closed the book slowly and set it aside. Later that night, as he tried to sleep, the creaking of the tower changed. It was no longer the normal, gentle sway of wind through wood. It had rhythm now, a pattern. Every few minutes, he could hear something shift, followed by silence, then another sound like pressure against the wall. He sat up and looked toward the door. It was locked exactly as he'd left it, but the feeling of isolation had changed shape. It was no longer just distance or silence. It was presence, like something outside knew he was inside, and it was waiting. Not trying to get in, just waiting. He woke up to static, not loud, not sharp, just a low, constant hiss, soft enough to blend with the natural silence of the forest, but unmistakably electronic, the kind of noise a machine makes when it's pretending to be quiet. It was coming from the radio again. He hadn't turned it on, the console lights were off, the dials untouched, but from the speaker, the sound kept bleeding through. A single frequency, pulsing faintly. He sat in front of it, not reaching for the power switch, just listening. Then, behind the static, a new voice emerged. Not distant, not unknown. His own. He froze, heart suddenly hammering in his chest. The voice wasn't repeating like before. It wasn't a loop. It was clear, direct, conversational. But the content made no sense. It was describing something he hadn't experienced yet. Cold front moved in faster than expected. Visibility dropped. Tower structure intact, but signal inconsistencies remain. I'm logging audio separately from now on, in case the pattern returns. He recognized the phrasing. He'd written field notes like that before, back when he was in remote signal camps. But he hadn't said these words recently. And yet, he heard the breath between the phrases, the way he always paused slightly before numbers, the cadence of someone not reading a script, but speaking in real time. He tried to recall if maybe he'd tested the mic the day before. Maybe some accidental recording had been saved, but he hadn't. There was no log file, no record of broadcast, and when the voice ended, the tape clicked off by itself. He sat there for several minutes, unsure whether to be afraid or fascinated. Then, slowly, he opened the cabinet beneath the radio and checked the tape reels again. This time, there were two. The original one was still there, the damaged loop with the phrase, "still here." But next to it was a fresh reel, labeled, time-stamped. Today's date, his initials. He hadn't written them. He played it back. It was him again, this time sounding more tired, more frayed. Fog's thick now. Something wrong with the compass. North changes when I'm not looking. Still no signal from the outside. I saw movement below the trees earlier, but nothing on the cameras. Beginning to think the tower doesn't just broadcast. The reel stopped abruptly. He turned toward the window. The fog hadn't lifted. It had thickened, pressing closer to the glass, dense and white, like a held breath waiting to exhale. He flipped on the spotlight again, hoping it would cut through, but the light barely penetrated, just a soft glow caught in haze. He pulled out his backup compass just to prove something was still fixed. The needle turned in slow circles, drifting lazily without ever locking in. For the first time, he felt truly displaced, not just lost in the woods, but misaligned with the rest of the world, as if the tower had shifted him onto some parallel layer of space where direction was optional and time didn't flow straight. He reached for the radio controls again, more urgently now. No response, no sound, just the hum. And then, a single knock on the outer door. Not wind, not wood settling. Knuckles. 1, 2, 3. Then silence. He didn't move. He didn't answer. Because in that moment, every part of him knew what he would find if he opened that door. Not something new, something familiar. Someone who looked exactly like him, standing in the snow, holding a recorder, asking to come in. He didn't sleep after the knock. Instead, he sat in the middle of the cabin floor, flashlight in hand, staring at the door. It never opened. Nothing came through. But the silence that followed felt heavier than any noise could have. As if the tower itself was waiting to see what he'd do next. By morning, the fog had thinned just enough for him to see the tree line again. Pale, skeletal trunks stretching into the cold. No movement, no sound, but the sense of presence remained. Not watching him from a distance, but surrounding him, beneath him. Like the forest was holding its breath too. He needed to get outside. The air inside the tower had turned dense. Each breath felt like it had to pass through layers of something unseen. He grabbed his coat, pocketed the compass, even though it no longer worked, and stepped into the cold.
Snow had fallen overnight. Not much, just enough to smooth out the landscape and erase all previous footprints. The path he had taken on his first day was gone, replaced with a clean, untouched surface. But 30 meters out, near the base of a thick pine, something broke the white, a piece of red cloth tied around the trunk. It was old, faded, but deliberate. He stepped closer and noticed more. Another strip tied farther ahead, and beyond that, another. A trail, a line of markers leading into the forest. He hesitated, then followed. The trails weren't evenly spaced. Some were close, almost hurried. Others were hundreds of meters apart. He moved cautiously, marking each turn in his notebook. The deeper he went, the quieter the world became. Even his own footsteps seemed to sink into the snow without sound. Eventually, the trail stopped at a small clearing. In the center stood a metal box, half buried in ice and pine needles. It looked like an old equipment case, military grade, reinforced corners, a rusted latch. He pried it open.
Inside was a recorder, and next to it, a photo. The image had faded, but he could still make out the scene. The very same tower, photographed from the exact same angle he'd seen on approach days before. But something was wrong. There were two people in the picture. One was standing on the ground, pointing up. The other was in the tower window, staring down. They were both him. He checked the back of the photo. No date, no name. Just a message written in block letters. Only one can leave. His pulse spiked. He looked around the clearing, but the forest remained still. He took the recorder and turned it on. Static. Then his voice again, this time breathless, panicked. If you're hearing this, you already know. It splits, it watches, it waits. Don't follow the signal back. Burn the tape. Shut the door. The recording ended. He stood in the snow for a long time, trying to process it. He looked at the tower in the distance. From here, it looked abandoned again. No light, no warmth. Just a silent spire in the pines. But in the reflection of his flashlight, just for a second, he thought he saw someone in the window, watching. He returned to the tower without following the red cloth markers. Instead, he cut directly through the woods, eyes fixed on the frame of steel barely visible through the trees. The air felt colder now. The fog had receded, but what remained was sharper, more precise. Each sound echoed longer than it should have. Each step seemed to land a beat too late. He climbed the stairs quickly, as if speed might help him outrun the weight building behind his eyes. By the time he reached the cabin, he was breathless. Inside, the radio was waiting. It was on again, though he hadn't touched it. The panel glowed with a low red light, and a recording was playing, though the reel wasn't moving. He heard himself speaking, but the voice was off, slower, detached. One leaves, one stays. That's always been the rule. He powered down the console, but the voice continued. You sent the last one back, remember. You chose the climb. The air inside the room thickened as if pressure were building behind the walls. He turned toward the window. The forest below looked the same, but now something stood at the edge of the clearing. Not a person, a shape. Familiar in outline, tall, still, facing the tower.
He closed the curtains and backed away. Every part of him wanted to run, to break the loop, to leave, but the door wouldn't open. Not locked, just unresponsive, like the handle was waiting for something he hadn't done yet. He turned back to the radio. This time he removed every cable, pulled the power cell, tore the tape reels from their mounts and dropped them into the stove. The flames caught slowly, black plastic curling and hissing as the spools melted. The voice stopped. For the first time in days, the air felt still. He sat for hours in the cabin, unsure what to expect. No knocks, no breathing through the static, just silence. Then, without warning, the emergency transmitter blinked. A signal. He rushed to it, flipping open the panel. A rescue frequency. Clean. Confirmed. A voice came through. "This is Unit Bravo 4. We've got you on thermal. Hold position. We're coming in." He didn't respond at first. He just listened. Then, slowly, he spoke into the mic. "Copy. I'm here." By sunset, the team arrived. 2 figures in orange jackets. Real, tangible. They carried him down the ridge, step by step, until the tower vanished behind the trees. No one mentioned the structure. No one said how they found him. Back at the base camp, medics checked his vitals. He was fine, normal. But when the technician in charge reviewed the emergency beacon logs, something strange appeared. The signal hadn't been triggered that day. It had been activated 2 weeks earlier, and it had been transmitting the same message every hour. "Copy. I'm here." When they asked him if that was his voice, he said yes, but he couldn't remember saying it. He was cleared to return home, though he didn't go back to his city, not immediately. He stayed near the tree line for several more days, driving between small towns, checking old maps, asking if anyone had ever heard of Tower 9. No one had. He even searched for it by air. There was nothing on the ridge. No structure, no relay, no trace. Just trees and silence. But sometimes, late at night, with the right receiver and a quiet sky, he still picked up a faint signal. Always the same voice, always the same line. "Copy. I'm still here."